Welcome. I'm Kim, host of Book Marketing Mania, and I'm so thrilled you're tuning in today as I'm sharing a special conversation with my friend Jeanette Tapley when she hosted me for a guest teaching for the Hope Podcasters membership community. We talked all about building your audience and marketing your book on podcast. And what I love the most is that while I was the invited guest, Jeanette is an incredible host, and she shared so many goodies that I learned from her as well. So I knew this was a conversation I wanted to share with you all here on the podcast. Jeanette hosts two podcasts, the Moms at Work podcast and the Joy Millionaire podcast. And as an ambassador for Hope Podcasters, she interviews fellow podcasters like me for their community. So you are in for a treat today. Let's get to it.
So, Kim, hello.
Hey, Jeanette. I'm so glad to be here with you all today.
Oh, thank you so much for hanging out with us. And Kim, I'm so curious, how did you get into marketing books?
Yeah, so I used to do corporate marketing, just kind of the, standard corporate marketing. And my husband was a sales guy and I was the marketing girl. That's how we met. And we were in the credit union division, so very far away from what I'm doing today. But I applied those lessons to what I'm doing today because probably about 6 years ago, I thought I wanted to write my own book. So I have a child with special needs. So Jeanette, now we haven't even talked about that. So we'll have to talk about that one day. But I have a child with special needs. And I thought that I might want to write a book about my journey as a special needs mom and just all the lessons God has taught me. And so I went to Proverbs 31 She Speaks conference, which was the only writing conference back then. And I went home and then I didn't do anything with it. And so I was like, okay, I'm not a writer. This is not for me. And I went back a second year and thought, okay, this year, I think I'm going to do it again. Like, I really think God is calling me to do this. And I was sitting in a marketing presentation that Lisa and Karen Eman put on, and they were talking about baking marketing into your book. And I love all their books. Like, I'm, huge fan of all their books. And I love to read Christian nonfiction. And I just really felt in that time that I was sitting there, Jeanette, in that session, that God just spoke to me and just said, this is why I called you to this. Like, I didn't call you to write a book yet. We still have a lot of work to do, but I called you to take your marketing skills and your love for Christian nonfiction and combine it and help these women that are amazing at writing and speaking, but they don't want to do the marketing side of it. So I just felt like he called my gifts into that area. And that's where I've just stayed. And I just love it so much.
Well, I love it. Well, on the podcaster side, I get to receive emails from Kim's. And so often, I know Jenna, my assistant, and I are like, Kim's email's great. Like, this will work for us. This won't work for us. And it's so nice to work with somebody who cares about a podcaster and the podcast instead of just like pitching random stuff. It's just, you can tell behind your marketing and behind your business that you actually care for your author and the host that you're pitching. And as one of the people you pitch to often, I just really love working with you. And I'm so, so thankful for your giftings. And I know we have so much more to talk about, but I'm just really thankful that God wastes nothing in the seasons that we experience.
Yeah, so true. Thank you, Jeanette. That means the world to me, coming from a host, because I know you see a lot of pitches for both of your podcasts.
We do. And it's fun. And I love it. So let's talk like the genesis of your podcast first, because I want to hear about your show and how you teach on your show, because you do something that I actually really struggle to do. My business and my podcast don't run in the same lane at all. So I'm editing podcasts and working on podcasts and coaching on podcasts and stuff like this. But then I switch hats and I turn into a host that has nothing to do with producing. So I have different hats that I have to put on, but your hat like seamlessly runs through the course of all that you do. So tell me more about your show.
Yeah. And it is, I serve Christian nonfiction authors and podcasters, obviously. And whenever I did not have this long dream of starting a podcast, but I was always involved in podcasting, pitching clients to podcasts like I did with Jeanette, and just helping podcasters figure out how to market their books or build an audience on podcasts. So I've gotten to know, a lot of podcasters. And then when I felt like, okay, I've been in this online business for a long time, but I didn't really have like an online presence. I mean, I had fun stuff on Instagram and I connected with lots of people, that were my target audience on Instagram, but I didn't really like feed content that way. And I definitely did not have any kind of a, long form evergreen blog or anything because I wasn't a writer. So I started thinking, okay, I really need to take this a little bit more seriously. And I feel like I have a lot of knowledge to share. How can I best share it? And I knew I didn't want to start a blog, like the old fashioned blog. So I thought podcasting, I love it so much. I just need to start a podcast. And so, at first when I started thinking about kind of having a mesh of all of it. Like I would talk some faith, talk about being a special needs mom, talk to all my favorite authors and, other people in marketing. And I did some of that in the beginning. But what I really noticed was like when I listened to what people had to say that were listening to the show, and they would either email me back or leave reviews for the show, or just me looking at my analytics, I started noticing which episodes got the most downloads or got the most attention from somebody giving me feedback. And that was when like I went all in on just marketing and especially podcast pitching. Once I really honed into that, then, I really got a lot of great feedback. So that's kind of how I've decided. I mean, I knew I wanted to talk book marketing. And like when I first started, I kind of looked at like what else was out there for book marketing, and then tried to figure out, well, how is my show going to be different? And I knew, at least at the time, what was different was, my audience who I was serving was Christian authors. And so, I've kind of book marketing mania, and I talk about, marketing your Christian book in less time on podcast.
That's so good. So one of the things within Hope Media, like we're a branch of Hope Media. So we have Hope writers, Hope podcasters, Hope speakers. They kind of all work together. And so I know that when it comes to our online presence, podcasting is typically the first step for so many of us because that creates our foundation of like evergreen content, whether it's like you're pulling from a blog or whether you're pulling from guests and stuff like that. So we kind of create that foundation, and then it leads to a book or it leads to speaking. Or some people say like, all right, I have this book idea, I have this book deal, I have this book self-published coming out, then I need a podcast. So we kind of like run this like circle of stuff. So I'd love to know, what would be a couple of tips that you have for somebody, whether they're starting fresh or starting new, like they don't have a book, but they have an idea, they have a heart for a book. Let's start with a podcast. Where do we start and how do we build our online presence podcasting in hopes to market a book someday?
Yeah, I think if you can get really clear on who your target audience is, because a lot of times we're like, oh, it's just, anybody, any Christian out there, or any man or woman, or, really getting clear on that helps, because that helps you decide what direction your content's going to go in. And then how you're different, than just any other podcast out there. And it could be similar, but you should have something a little bit unique about your own show. But test out the content that you want to talk about in a book. Like I know a lot of people are afraid to blog about that content that might be in a book one day or put it on a podcast. But even if I heard your whole book on a podcast, I would probably not ever remember that when your book comes out. And if I love you as a podcaster, I wouldn't care, right? Because I'd be like, oh, now I can just take the podcast in a book form with me. I think just figuring out what you want to write about, and then thinking about how you can put that on your podcast and start talking about it and get known for that particular topic and how you're helping people, with some kind of struggle they're probably going through, whether it's, they need to learn how to study the Bible, or, it's about marriage or being a special needs mom, or, all kinds of things that we can talk about within our faith world or outside the faith, depending on the type of podcast you're going to have. I think just kind of honing in on that, and then just start talking about it and see the reception you get from it. And at the same time, definitely being strategic in building your audience of email list, like making sure you're building this audience on a podcast, but make sure you are at the same capturing them. As we all know, all this stuff can go away. We don't own it all. I mean, we kind of own our own podcast, I guess, but still want to make sure that we are getting them on an email list so we can stay in touch with them. And if you're pitching a publisher, they're going to want to see, they're going to be so excited that you have a podcast, but they're also going to want to see a little bit of numbers to back it up and how many people are on your email list so that you could sell a book to them one day.
Yeah, that's so good. What kind of questions do you ask as you get to know who your audience is? Because that's one thing we talk a lot about, that, like know your audience. But like, how do we know our audience? How do we take what our message is and really hone in who we're speaking to?
Yeah, I think just, getting out and talking to people. And I think that's what a beautiful thing like about what Hope Media has done. We have this amazing community of people to turn to, and everybody is generous, right? So just ask people, like just, whenever you envision this is the person I think I want to talk to, then go find somebody that kind of matches that and just sit down and talk to them. Like it could be over a Zoom. It could be over a quick coffee chat, in person at a conference. Like you just talked about, Hope Writers is going to have their conference. Like just ask if you can get a few minutes of somebody's time, and then just, imagine if they are your ideal audience, then what are some questions that you want to ask them about some of their struggles, if they'd be open to it. And then just, that'll really kind of help you hone in on, okay, this is the person I want to speak to on my podcast, or, okay, I want to speak to this person, but I don't want this particular subset of this person, So I think it really helps just to ask people, and everybody's so generous. I mean, you could be up front and say, hey, I'm doing some market research, or you can just be a little sneaky about it, and just not tell them and just ask questions. But yeah, I think just being a really good listener and just not being afraid to ask people to kind of help. And also, you could be listening to other podcasts that are similar to what you're thinking about, even if it's like in another genre or something, just listen to a couple of them and see, and you'll get a really quick idea too of like, okay, I like that, but if I was going to do it, I would do it this way, and that'll really help you to know who you're talking to.
That's so good. I also think asking your friends in your kind of close knit circle, like, what do you see in me? What do you come to me for? Because if you're asking like, what problems am I helping you with? Then you can see like, okay, this is the way. One of the ways that I've done this recently is I have come out of a tough season with some kids and a depression diagnosis and the uphill climb out of that. And it's been really, really amazing to see what God can do. But the passion I have now for moms who have struggled with teens with the mental health like that, I'm like, that's who I'm talking to. I was talking directly to the mom. And once you know, like that passion within you, like this is it, then it's like, okay, then it takes like, okay, I'm talking to moms. Well, okay, now I know I'm talking to moms with kids who have XYZ. And it just kind of like, you go from that to like that, like funnel down. And so it's really, really fascinating. And so
definitely looking at, where God's taken you is a really good place to look.
Yes. Looking back and be like, oh, I wish somebody told me this. And then honing in on that for sure. Let's talk about marketing, because marketing is a big word for selling, and selling feels scary and it feels like we're those like, I don't want to say slimy doors to door people, but it feels like it sometimes, right? Like you show up on the internet and you're like, hi, do you like me? Will you buy from me? And that's not what we're doing, but we have to at the same time market ourselves. So let's talk the basics of marketing and how we can do this well, because you do this so beautifully. So hit us with some tips.
Yeah, I think, for our audience here, podcasters, is, thinking about, sales to me is the scary word, right? My husband's a sales guy and he just laughs at me all the time. Because I would rather market anybody in the world, but myself, I don't want to do, and I don't want to sell. Like, I just don't love it, but it is part of business and it's part of being an author. It's part of being a podcaster. You have to sell your podcast to new listeners, whether you like that word or not, right?
Yeah.
But I think just, thinking about on your podcast, I just always go back to, marketing is really just letting people know you can help them. Like you have some way to help them. It doesn't have to be a book today. It doesn't have to be any kind of a paid product or coaching or anything. It could just be your podcast that you're getting on there and sharing from your heart and helping somebody. So just think of it that way. Marketing is really just letting people know you can help them. And how is the best way to do that? And I think podcasting is a great way to do that. And so just always go to it with that mentality, and then again, you're going to give them some kind of a call to action, whether it's getting them on your email list or buying your product or whatever when the time comes. But if you can just kind of go into it with the heart of just serving, people are going to automatically be attracted to that. And they're, even if you never say anything, they're going to go check out what you have, to sell or offer them, on an email freebie or anything like that. So I think that's where, at least for me, where it starts is just go into it with a servant's heart. And I also think that makes it so much easier when you're starting. You're just like, okay, I don't have to worry about selling anything. I'm just going to get on the podcast, get behind the mic and start serving my target audience, and the rest will come. And if you can kind of think about it like that, that makes it a little bit easier.
It's so true. And I think that even as podcasters, if we go into each interview saying, this is how I will solve this problem, and we're not going to solve every problem, right? But if we can go into it with, this is the fix, and then title it with that some sort of way, like, do you struggle with this? Listen. And so you're saying like, you've got a problem and I can help you fix it. That you're letting them know just up front, this is the problem. This is a fix. Let's work together. And so I think that's so key. It's something that I was missing out for a lot of years, just because I was like, here I am, instead of being like, here's the problem, here's the solution. I'm your Sherpa.
Yeah. Absolutely. And if you have a solo show,
Mhm.
I mean, I love having solo episodes because it really is, it's all about you. When you have a guest, it's typically all
Yeah.
about your guest, but you can't kind of mesh it when you have a guest, make sure that you are, and I think Ren Robbins was on, y'all, did a teaching for
Yes.
y'all. And she talked about this a lot. Like, don't hide behind your guest. Make sure that your
Yeah.
audience is getting to hear from you as well. But, just your guests will be able to help you market your podcast because they're going to tell people about it. They're going to share their episode.
Yeah.
So I love just that. For me, that's just a whole collaboration, whenever you
Mhm.
have a guest on your show. So even if you think I'm going to do a solo podcast and never have guests, just be open to it. I mean, I
Yeah.
go on and on about guesting, but I mean, just be open to having guests on your show because it's a great way to collaborate. You just never know what might come out of that.
Mhm. Okay, let's talk about being a guest on shows and getting guests on our shows, because that is a really tricky, it seems it's tricky, but it's really not.
Mhm.
How do we ask guests to be on our show?
Yeah, I would just reach out to. Well, I'll back that up because whether I'm going to pitch to be a guest on a show or I'm wanting to pitch a guest, I do like to kind of warm up their relationship a little bit and have some kind of interaction with them wherever that person is online. Just getting to know each other a little bit helps. I would definitely, if they are a podcaster, whether you're pitching to be a guest or you're pitching them to guest, if they have their own show, I would leave a review first because you
Mhm.
can mention that, and that again, that just means so much to podcasters.
Yeah.
That you took the time to leave a few, a sentence or two about their show. So I would just reach out to them. And I like to do it in email because it's so much easier for the host to keep track of rather than like a DM. But you could, just ask them in a DM either way. Like, what is the best way for you to accept a guest submission? Or what is the best way to reach out to you to ask you to be a guest on my show? Because sometimes, like if they have a book they're marketing, they're going to refer you to a PR person. Sometimes if they've never even been on a show, they might be like, well, I don't know, they won't even know.
Yeah.
So I like to, if you've been touching base with them, then you could connect with them in DM, but I really like sending an email. So it's just that much easier for everybody to kind of keep track of. But that's the way I like to just reach out, I always mention if I've left a review of the show, whether it's at the beginning of the email or at the end. I just always like to let them know I've done that. And then again, it's always about the listeners, the value you're bringing to the listeners. So either you as a guest, here's what I would love to be a guest and serve your listeners and talk about XYZ. And if you want them to be a guest on your show, then, here's what my show's about. And I would love for you to be a guest to talk about XYZ. So you always just make sure it's about, how you're going to serve the listeners. And, there's a few other things you could add in there, but that to me is the biggest thing, is just making sure it's all about the topic for the listeners. And so it can be really super brief about you, the guest, or really super brief about your own podcast, because people can go check out more information as they want.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I think that's so good. I was telling you before we started that I am pitching for guests to come on the show, and I have a template email that we use, and then I went in and was like, this is everything I love about each influencer that I'm asking, so that my assistant can then take that and craft it and be like, this post, this spoke to me, this podcast episode, being really specific. And making sure, this is one of those things, making sure that like you do follow them on the platforms that you say you follow them on. So that you're saying like, in my situation, it's like, I adore you. I think you're amazing. Here's why I want to share you with my audience. Can we partner together? One of the things I love about when I get pitched guests, especially from you, is like, this is exactly the conversation that I think would fit on your show. And it's like, oh, you're right. I haven't thought about having that conversation. And so it's such a good thing to be pitched and to pitch. And so when we are asking to be guests on a show, it's saying like, here's how I can serve your audience. Is there anything else that we need to follow up with? Or is there what is the next step? Like, so we send that pitch email. I'd love to be on your show, because pitching to be guests on a show points back to our own shows, right? And having that kind of loop mentality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like to encourage people to, before you pitch to be a guest, is kind of making sure your own home base is ready. So, you've got your social media, you're putting out content that's applicable to what you want to talk about. If they come check out your show, are you releasing episodes, or have you fallen victim to pod fade, which unfortunately happens a lot, so they want to see all those things because they're going to share your show with their audience, and they want to make sure that, this is something they want to share. And I will say, like, as you probably know that, I mean, depending on who you're pitching, it looks a little different, right? I mean, if you're pitching a big influencer that, maybe they're in the middle of a book release or something, then the one thing I think nowadays is like making things, well, whether you're pitching anybody really to be a guest or pitching a guest, is like making things as brief as possible because everybody's just so inundated, right?
Yeah.
But I think too with like with authors that are in the midst of a book launch, I mean, used to it was like, oh, put me on any podcast, the PR can get me on. Now they're a little bit more pickier because it does take such a time investment, as we all know as podcasters. But I think, letting them know this can be really brief. It doesn't have to be an hour-long conversation because like I know with my guest, I record the intro separately. So I just say, look, we're going to hop on and we're getting right to it. And, you can have just a few questions ready to ask them and then be done with it. And you can always add extra commentary because you should let your listeners know why you wanted to invite that guest on. But all that can be recorded separately. So I think that's super important if you can let them know, like you're not asking for an hour of their time. I think that would be super important. And then, depending on who you're asking to be a guest, is the beauty of hosting your own show is there's to swap guest opportunities.
That's right.
Because I mean, guesting on other shows is the best way to grow your own show. So everybody wants to be a guest. And so, being able to offer that if it's a fit, being able to offer that you could actually swap, if you're asking to be a guest on somebody else's show, I think is something that we don't do enough of.
Yeah, I love that. And one of the things I love doing if you do a swap is like trying to line up the release of those episodes the same week because you're like, listen to the conversation over here and then listen to the conversation over here because really you're getting two very different conversations because if I'm interviewing somebody, I'm focused on them. And if they're interviewing me, they're focused on me. Therefore, you're getting this really dynamic conversation of two people. It's really like, it's been really fun when I've done that.
Yeah. That's. I think I heard you and Stephanie Gass do that, right?
Oh
on
my gosh!
Shows. Yeah, which we could talk about. And I know Stephanie did a guest teaching too. Yeah, she's amazing.
Yes,
y'all are both great. So but I love the way y'all did that.
Yeah, so fun. So we're marketing our own podcast by being guests on other podcasts. We're marketing our podcast by asking guests to be on our podcast, and then we're marketing by sharing and letting people know. One, we have a podcast. Like so often, people are like, "Oh, I had no idea you had a podcast." I'm like, 5 years in, my bad. I don't talk about it enough. So how often do you think we should be talking about our stuff and promoting our things online? Like what is like a good marketing
well, I'm not sure. I don't know if there's like a magical number. I mean, I guess it depends on your own content creation, where you're putting out content. But I definitely think, again, it goes back to kind of having your home base ready. I mean, like definitely make sure whatever social media platforms you're active on, that the fact that you're a host of XYZ podcast is in your bio because people see that all the time. So even if you haven't promoted your podcast in a while in your feed, they're going to see that in your bio. But yeah, I think it ought to look different. Like it just used to be the standard graphic or a standard audiogram, it all looks the same and people start kind of tuning out on that. So just think of, I know like Jeanette, you get on and talk about who you're going to have on this show as well as your podcast and stuff. So I think just different ways you can share that same content that's coming on your podcast in different ways is so, so helpful. And don't be afraid, you're not going to bombard people as long as it's not the same thing over and over and over. But again, it's all about marketing is helping people, and they don't know that you have the answer for them if you don't get out there and share it. But also like think about if you are going to be a guest on podcasts, like if your goal, and there's so many different goals you could have for this any time of the year, right? But if your goal is I want to build my email list. And so I'm hoping whatever conversation I have on somebody else's podcast is going to lead them to naturally, when I mention my lead magnet, they're going to want to sign up for it, right? Well, if let's just say, so obviously they know you may have mentioned that you're a podcaster, but maybe you didn't in the interview. I mean, it might have got mentioned in your bio, but like they didn't pay attention to that. So like when you send them a lead magnet, no matter what your lead magnet is, you could also mention that you have a podcast and here's some podcast episodes that maybe are complementary to that lead magnet or put those in your new subscriber sequence. You could do like for you, Jeanette, that has a bajillion episodes, like you could do a roundup of like, episodes that relate to this topic or, there's so many different ways that I think we kind of forget about that we can also mention our podcast, in our weekly emails and our, sequences and just anywhere you get the opportunity to drop it, you can. And, throughout an interview, you can just like casually drop some little nuggets that, oh gosh, I heard back from a listener that said, XYZ and you just, so many different ways you could do that. But yeah, just don't be afraid to get out there and share it as much as you can.
That's right. One of the things I've been trying to do, both on social media and then on my newsletter, my email list, is to do a content roundup, because
Mm-hmm.
we know a fraction of the followers that we have on social media, and really even listeners, aren't getting everything that we are putting out there.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it feels like we're throwing spaghetti at a wall. And so one of the things I've been trying to do is monthly being like, here's my favorite episodes. Here's what I'm actually listening to. This is what I've loved watching or reading as a consumer. And then here's like what you might have missed on the podcast and or on social media. Like here's like some posts that I did in case you missed it. But sending that out to my newsletter, because it's one of those things where it's like, you're here, like, the difference between newsletter and social media is like, I feel like social media is like, here's my backyard. We're all here. We're all welcome. I'm so glad y'all are here. Social media, yay. And then my newsletter is like, come sit at my table and let's have a cup of coffee. Like it's like a more intimate space.
Yeah.
And so that's where I can be like, did you see this? And they'll be like, no, I was in the room, but I totally missed that happening. And so having that social media is amazing. We need social media. But having that like intimate space to be like, okay, let's chat a little bit deeper about these things is one of my favorite ways to view an email list. And because as podcast hosts, it's not focused on us. It's focused on our guests.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I love that you put those on your emails, Jeanette. That's such a great idea.
Okay, Kim, are there any other like leftover tips you have for us on marketing or pitching or podcasting?
I just think it's the best way to get your message out there is podcasting. It just opens so many doors because you can collaborate with other people with, guesting, just getting into a podcast community like this, being able to be amongst other people that are, maybe in the same stage of writing a book or, they're building their businesses, marketing their books. I think just getting started and not being worried about too much of them. We've talked about a lot of information today, but don't get worked up like you have to go guest today or you have to have everything just perfect, just kind of getting started, and you're going to tweak it along the way. And I was thinking about, when you were talking about marketing episodes, I mean, it's so great to market your past episodes that maybe somebody missed, because you never know when you've gotten new people along the way, like maybe they just started tuning into your podcast today. Well, they don't know about all these past episodes if they don't take time to, go back. So don't be afraid to, like, if you have a really good episode that you think you did really well on, and it's, would really lead people over to your email list and learning more about your products or services, is don't be afraid to re-air it, and you can even, edit it as you need to, but just, don't be afraid to put that content out there again. Like we're talking about, we, share it on social, share it on email, but you could also share it again on your podcast. And I think that's super important. And just focusing in on how do I help people? And then how can this content on the podcast lead them that direction and let them know that I can help them?
I love that. And I think the last thing I'll just like tack on to that is I used to market or like used to like share a podcast and then forget about it. Like, 'cause it's a weekly show.
Yeah.
And you're constantly pumping out content. So I'd be like, well, this show's out and we're not talking about it again. And I've had people come back to me and be like, oh my gosh, your adoption story was so beautiful. I'm like, that was like 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh,
share it again. Yeah.
Keep that content going. Like the conversations that we have matter, and it is evergreen content. And like you said, if we need to cut some stuff out of it here or there, that's fine, but it's evergreen content. Use it as though it is evergreen content and pull back to it. And if it is not evergreen and you don't stand by that episode anymore, take it off that feed.
Yeah,
like
exactly. Yeah.
No shame in archiving anything. And Kim, I'm a big Disney person. And one of my favorite facts is that Walt Disney put Snow White back in theaters 7 times.
Oh,
he
wow.
repurposed
Yeah.
that content 7 times. We can repurpose content. We can reshare things. It's perfectly fine to reshare some stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love that you said that about just, because we do want it to be evergreen. And then, we do have to think about new people don't know those things. Like that's such an important part of who you are, Jeanette. And so if I fall in love with your show, I want to hear that adoption story, but I may not go back, 3 years of episodes to find it. So let me know again. And again, people that may have heard it, they are going to want to hear it again too. So don't be afraid to do that for sure.
So good. Okay. Last couple questions. These are rapid fire. So first thing that comes to your mind, this is podcasting.
Okay.
What is your favorite tool or resource that you use in podcasting?
I use Otter transcription tool. I don't know if you're familiar with that, OTTER. And I bought like at the annual, plan when it was on sale. I use that like crazy for my own show to transcribe so then I could put it on a blog or make up, however I want to market things. Or I might just pull out something that I'm like, oh yeah, I need to expand on this for another episode. But also like when I'm pitching podcast, I'll go and like check out their shows and you can download their episodes, quickly and then have them transcribed. And I might find little nuggets in there that I'm like, oh, hey, on episode XYZ, you talked about this. Well, I would love to further conversation, or you might find out little tidbits about somebody that you're wanting to pitch. I just love it. It's so easy to use.
Okay. That's so good. I know we've talked a lot about Descript and other ones like that, but I haven't heard about Otter. If you had to start over, what would you do differently today that you didn't do when you started your podcast?
Oh gosh. I probably release shorter episodes nowadays because I think people's attention span is so much shorter. And definitely get in community like this. I mean, being able to ask somebody the questions that you feel silly asking, or the questions that you're Googling over and over, it's just so much faster to ask somebody that's a couple of steps ahead of you. And everybody's so generous with their information. I probably would have just been a little bit braver about that, or I would be now braver about that for sure. Just being like, okay, I'm just going to ask to get me to help and get me on my way so much faster, I think, than probably all the time I took 3 years ago or however long that was.
Yeah. I feel like there was like this, a little bit of like a grassroots dude on your own, like figure it out a few years ago. And now it's like, here's everything I know. Take it, leave it. What works for you? Let's go. Like just start. Like that's our biggest thing. It's like, just start.
Absolutely. Yeah. I totally agree. Yeah, just start. Yeah. Yeah. You can get better. You're going to get better for sure. Yeah. And like you said, you can always scrap old stuff if you didn't like it.
Yeah. Okay, the last one. What is something, or who or what is something that you're learning from right now?
Oh gosh, mine right now is Think Media is the name of the company. They have a podcast channel and they have a book called YouTube Secrets, and they just released, I think, a new version of it because I didn't even know about it, but I love reading, obviously, and it's on my Kindle. But I've been really intrigued about YouTube, like either putting your podcast on YouTube, but maybe not this just the audio, like really looking at how we can do some videos to maybe reach a new audience. So that's been really intriguing to me. And I've been diving into his book for sure.
Oh, that's so good. Kim, thank you so much for being with us. Can you tell us where we can find you, where we can listen to your podcast? Tell us like all the things, because we definitely want to connect with you further, especially as our friends are writing and releasing. I know that you and I will be in contact hopefully in a few months. Well, it'll probably be about a year, but we'll talk.
It's so exciting. Yeah, absolutely. Anybody building your platform or, marketing your book on podcast, either as a host or guest, I'd love to help you in any way I can. So yeah, you can reach out to me at my website, kimstewartmarketing.com, or tune into my podcast, Book Marketing Mania, and it's available on all the podcast players as well as my website.
Awesome. Kim, thank you so much for your time today. This was just so much fun. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Oh, me too, Jeanette. Thank you so much. Y'all, isn't Jeanette such a delight? I hope you'll check out her podcast as well as the Hope Podcasters community, and I'll put links to connect with them in the show notes. Thanks for tuning in today, and as always, I'll be there for you to help you build your audience and market your book one podcast at a time. See you next time.